Wait for a few more people to start. 2 o'clock. Great. Well, welcome everyone to the panel discussion on modern living, the challenge of housing, a change in society. My name is Chris Warrall and I am editor of the Red Brick blog, the home of progressive housing policy debate, and I'm also a member of the Labour Housing Group Executive Committee. The format of this event will open up with a 3-minute remarks from each of our 3 fantastic panellists, followed by a progressive discussion on the challenges of housing, a changing society. We'll end with answering a couple of questions from the audience, so do comment with yours in the chat box if you can. We know that home ownership has declined from an all-time high under the last Labour government, spent back in 2003, down to just 63% in 2018. Coinciding with this is the private rented sector now occupies a larger share of our market than social housing, where we've seen private renters double from below 10% in the mid-1990s to nearly 20% in 2018. In a country where 1 in 6 people do not think they'll ever afford their own home, which rises to 1 in 4 in London, Labour desperately needs to reinvent itself to be the party of aspiration once again, particularly after recent polling by Savanta Comrades suggests people think that the Green Party presents a better case for the being party of aspiration than Labour. The answer to these challenges stem from tackling our country's systemic housing shortage. France, with a similar population, builds 400,000 homes a year. Yet in our country, at decade-long highs, we barely achieve 240,000. Our failure to simply build enough homes has been caused by a set of rules that have been crying out for centre-left modernisation for decades, which could quite literally rebuild our country. We've also some of the weakest tenants and leaseholder rights in the world, which simply fail to protect people from the circumstances rules governing building safety and planning new homes have created. To discuss these issues, we have on today's panel Councillor Shama Tatler, who is Cabinet Member for Regeneration, Property and Planning for Brent Council in North West London. We have Councillor Sharon Thompson, Cabinet Member for Homes and Neighbourhoods for Birmingham City Council, and Anthony Breach, a housing and planning expert from the Centre for Cities, who's won prizes for research on how the planning system creates housing shortages and drives wealth inequality. Just a flag to everyone that will be recording this event, and we shall now go to our first panellists for their opening remarks. We start with Shama, then Sharon, followed by Anthony. You've got 3 minutes each. Shama, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and hi everyone. And I'll jump straight into it because you've only got 3 minutes, and it's a subject I could talk to you about all day. So it's something I'm really passionate about. And I've been in this brief for the last nearly 5 years, and in Brent we do a huge amount of delivery of housing. But it doesn't come without its challenges, and I think local authorities are seeing this much more on the ground in terms of the difficulties and barriers often faced by delivering housing for our residents. So the first key challenge I think I'd like to talk to a little bit, and there are 4 that I want to sort of mention, and then we can delve into a bit deeper through the discussions and questions, is, in my opinion, understanding that successful housing delivery cannot be separated from regeneration of place. In order to address the inequalities that good housing can address, regeneration of place has to be side and parallel and alongside that, priority alongside that, addressing inequalities around transport, around digital accessibility, around infrastructure such as schools and medical centres, about high streets, about sustainability and the climate emergency. All should be addressed in parallel to the housing delivery. And as a party, we need to reconcile, I think, in a way, how we talk about regeneration in that aspect, and understand that actually it should and can be really important. The other difficulty alongside that, however, is understanding that other public sector bodies are in similar difficulties in terms of pressures, such as the NHS, TfL, Network Rail, and so on, about how we deliver that infrastructure that's needed. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think in terms of difficulty and challenges are how we connect with our communities. Keir said this morning that communities should be involved in how we look at delivering change. But what point in the process should we be looking to work with our communities on that? And we've got examples in Brent of how we've delivered that. We've given planning permission to over 9,000 homes this past year. And a lot of that actually in terms of council delivery has been in partnership with communities about how we do that, sometimes more successfully than others. So how do we connect with our communities? The third area I think is really important as a party and as local authorities we need to grapple with is who delivers that housing and who delivers that regeneration. In the current picture and current local government funding positions, it's difficult for local authorities to do this on our own. As much as we'd love to be able to say council house delivery should be the way forward, and it should be the way forward for us, but it's not the only way forward. Resourcing, expertise, land value, land availability, all of those pressures make it difficult for local authorities to do it on our own. So we have to be open and willing to work with partners to do that successfully. Where I think local authorities do have a key role is setting the direction and principles of what we expect that delivery to look like. And finally, addressing the policy landscape. It is a messy landscape currently in planning. In any one area or locality, there could be 3 or 4 levels of policy that an applicant has to look at addressing, and quite often are contradictory to each other. So how do we address that? A local plan takes over 2 years currently to, at the very minimum, be formed, and it becomes a political football. And if we're truly to address good housing, we need to address the policy landscape to deliver successful housing and also deliver at speed and quality and address the challenges of the 21st century. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Shama. Sharon, opening remarks.
Thank you very much. And just like Shama, I'm going to try and keep it as concise as possible because I think all of us could speak about this forever, these type of topics. So for me, when it comes to supporting particularly those who are vulnerable and particularly homelessness across the country, when it comes to housing, I genuinely think that smart housing policy will concern itself with not just housing, but people, local economy, and that would include financial inclusion. That's absolutely important. And we know that when it comes to a lot of the times when it's supporting vulnerable people, it also means that once they are inside of a property, they're at risk of falling outside of systems and outside of policies, and at risk of losing that property once they've actually gained it. So we need to make sure that the system is set up to make sure that help them to maintain that as much as possible. And across the country, just like everywhere else, Birmingham's seen significant numbers. But what we wanted to do was actually go back to the old Labour principles that were set out in the previous Labour government when it came to homelessness, and actually start to look at upstream prevention whilst also supporting those that were already in crisis, and that's absolutely essential. And one of the reasons why I think that's essential, because we have to think about the future renters to stop them from becoming the homelessness populations, whilst also dealing with some of the policy challenges that we're facing here and now. So you can't do that on your own as a council, and it has to come with collaboration, and stop looking at things in silos. So just coming from a housing perspective, but crossing across the vertical lines across departments. That's how we can truly start to address some of these issues. And like Shama said, you know, regeneration, everything else, it all ties in together. We've had a lot of challenges with the area of housing which sits outside almost by itself, and that has been exempt accommodation, and you can read the blog that I wrote on that, that's in the red brick at the moment. But going back to the upstream and supporting, some of the things that we've tried to do in Birmingham to try and look at that was things like addressing the empty property strategies and understanding that the private rented sector have a part to play when it comes to supporting vulnerable people, bringing homes back into use because we need to build, but we also need to deal with the current stock that's there. Building dormer bungalows to help those that are older people that are in 3-bedroom houses, free up the family houses that we actually need. And then also things looking in the crisis prevention space, which was things like developing a quality assurance framework for providers of what we expect in the city, a charter of rights with people that live within that type of accommodation so they understand what their rights are. And one of the most exciting ones for us in Birmingham is that as a house builder, we also have, we take £500 from every build that we do, put it in a scholarship fund, and we actually send young people into education. So we have people that are from marginalised communities who now have first-class honours degrees in planning, in all those type of areas of housing, market and development, to become the future planners, but supporting in their journey to become future renters and house builders and buyers. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions coming up as well.
Great, thank you very much, Sharon. It's very interesting. Anthony, see what you've got to say about wealth inequality in the planning system.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to give like a very brief overview of kind of the high level of kind of the housing crisis, why we have a housing crisis in this country, and some of our research looking at the planning system's relationship to that. So the overarching problem in an international context is, as Chris mentioned at the start, a shortage, that we're really not building enough housing. Like, as he said, we're probably building about 240,000 a year before the pandemic, and places like France build 400,000 a year. I think even that sort of understates the problem a bit. A country like Japan builds 900,000 homes a year, and their population is actually currently falling. So there's really a big difference between where the UK kind of currently is and then where international leaders and best practice are. And whether you focus on kind of homelessness or tenants' rights or boosting social housing or home ownership or improving the quality of housing or kind of energy efficiency for housing, but the lack of homes then makes all of those problems so much harder to solve. And there needs to be more kind of development and supply in order to tackle those problems. And kind of the short reasons as to why we have such a shortage in this country is because we have a really quite dysfunctional planning system by international standards. I think probably the single most important thing to take away from what I'm saying is that we have a planning system where you can propose something that complies with the local plan, and it can still be denied planning permission at kind of either by planning officers or at the committee stage by elected councillors. And this kind of case-by-case decision-making, this what's called discretion, creates a kind of bottleneck on the supply of new homes, makes it very, very uncertain and risky for new development to proceed. And it is linked as well in other countries like Ireland and also like San Francisco in the States or New York City, with much lower housing supply, much more expensive and unaffordable housing, and then also greater inequality as a result. So what we've set out in kind of a program of research we've done over the past year and a half, I would say, is so we need to replace that kind of case-by-case discretionary planning system and move towards a much more flexible but rules-based planning system, where if you propose to build something that complies with the rules, you legally must be given planning permission and allowed to proceed on that basis. And we can see that, I saw a question in the comments about, how does France build 400,000 homes a year? I'm sure we'll get maybe some questions about how does Japan build 900,000 homes a year? It's because they have systems where, if you follow the rules, then there's certainty and there's minimal kind of risk in the process, where developers know that they can build if they follow those rules. And there can still be community consultation in that process. We can have that in the creation of those rules, kind of how those rules are applied within communities, and also have methods to kind of capture the land value and redistribute that to fund social housing or to tackle homelessness within local authorities. All of these things can be addressed and kind of included within such a new approach. But we really do have to think about what's been kind of the one constant since 1947 when our current planning system was introduced, and how do we kind of move that towards one which is much more in keeping with better housing outcomes and cheaper housing we see in the rest of the world.
Thank you, Ant. That's very interesting as well. We'll be going on to the discussion now between now and 2:35. We'll be having a chat about the inequalities that are in our system, what we can do about it. And at 2:35, we'll be sort of going into questions from the audience. As Ant's pointed out, we've received some before closing at 2:50. So, Sharon, you wrote in the recent Redbit blog that this exempt accommodation sector has doubled in 2 years. Could you just...
Chris, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you, Sharon. At least someone said it. So just pointing out that we're going to be moving into discussion now on the sort of points about the wealth inequality before moving to questions from the audience at 2:35. Sharon, could you tell us a bit more about the exempt accommodation sector? I understand from your recent Redbit blog, you told us that the exempt accommodation sector has doubled in size over the last 2 years. Can you just tell us about how and why and what it is?
So the exempt sector is sort of supported housing, and it's a sector that almost sits by itself because it's not commissioned by councils or anything else like that. It's regulated by social housing regulator. There's no one overseeing the support side of it. And the criteria for it is just to have more than minimal amounts of support, which is very woolly within itself. And we've seen the sector grow in the city, where a lot of people are going into the market because it's quite lucrative, because you get higher rates of housing benefit. It can also push people into vulnerability because actually they have to pay money out of their universal credit as well towards the rent. So we're doing a piece of work and looking at it, and we're saying that actually there needs to be more powers for local councils. It skips across planning, so selective licensing and other things don't apply to it. So you'll find in some areas you'll have over concentration of exempt accommodation on one street, and the vulnerability will attract people who exploit vulnerability, and that causes more problems. Standard of housing isn't consistent. So we're running a campaign around that, and we're pushing the government to make legislative changes, but also to stop looking in silo, but working across different departments in order to get the solutions.
Thank you. And Shama, can you tell us a bit more about, what is successful region? I know in Brent, you've worked on some, incredibly progressive regeneration schemes around there of all tenures, but can you tell us a bit more about the challenges faced and what makes one successful?
So it's a combination of factors in terms of successful regeneration in my experience. It's understanding what you're trying to address with that regeneration. So what is it, obviously, aside from housing, that we need to obviously look at delivering? And obviously in Brent, we've got, just under 2,000 households in temporary accommodation, for example. And that we cannot sustain that on any level. But it's also what are you trying to address with that regeneration? And you speak to residents who've lived through it. It's not just housing that they want to see for their families or for their households. It's opportunity. It's designing homes and communities that are safe, that are well connected, that have the infrastructure and the facilities and the amenities that they need. So it's actually co-designing master plans, if you will, or regeneration schemes that address all of those challenges and not just delivering housing, and doing alongside the communities about what it is. So in principle, an area might know development's coming, or an area might know that regeneration is going to take place, or we're going to be delivering something. But what that looks like, we do with the community, and actually that's actually done. It may take a little bit of time in terms of the initial phasing about talking with communities, but then when it gets to planning, and then when it gets to actually delivering, it becomes a lot easier in terms of having residents who are against it. Now, it doesn't come without difficulties. Obviously, things will in a place like Brent, because of the tight nature of the space and addressing fears and myths and challenges. But that regular communication is massively important, and understanding what is it that you're trying to deliver. Because if you're not clear on those objectives, nothing's going to be successful. And housing on its own is not going to be things that we need to address inequality that we've talked about previously here. So, and also and local authorities being very clear on how things are going to be funded. That's hugely important right now. Where is the money going to come from? Is it coming from MHCLG to help us subsidise it? Are we going to use our right to buy receipts? Is the HRA account going to be enough to deliver it? Or do we need to get external funding, private investing in, to actually deliver that change? Because we need to be very clear about what is it that's more of a priority, delivering that change and addressing those inequalities, or sticking to making sure that only the local authority delivers it. In some cases, we can't be the only organisation to deliver that. So it's about facing that challenge as well. And we've been really successful in doing that.
No, you definitely have. And Anthony, so how does the planning system create wealth inequality? And I know the Centre for Cities have been working on flexible zoning as an alternative to what the Tories have proposed. Can you tell us a bit more about what the differences are?
Yeah, so between what the Conservatives have proposed and what we've proposed is we've set up kind of a more kind of classical zoning system that you see in other countries, right, where the central government would define maybe a dozen or so zones that as kind of the intensity of the land you want to be, how you want it to be used. You might separate between, say, suburban residential, which allows for semi-detached houses, maybe mid-rise buildings, maybe kind of a few shops and kind of small offices, etc. Right through to, as you increase that intensity, through to like city centre commercial, where you can get skyscrapers and much bigger kind of office plates and tall high-rise buildings in the centre. That rule set would be defined by national governments, and then as you if land is kind of put into one of those zones by a local authority, then a developer which proposed something which complied with those zones would be able to build whatever is allowed by that actual zone. And that's what we see kind of good zoning systems elsewhere in the world, like Japan. That's what their system looks like. What kind of the Conservative government has proposed is a framework where they just have 3 different zones generally, where one is protected, so it would be like the current system we have at the moment, a renewal zone where if you propose something that complies with the design guide that they're creating, you're allowed to build anything you want, and then similarly like a growth zone where if you propose anything really that kind of happens in the growth zone, then you can build whatever you want that kind of happens within that growth zone. And we presented kind of a responses and a kind of consultation to that, and we think there's that framework itself would be an improvement over the current discretionary system. But what we've proposed, our flexible zoning proposal, looks more like what we see in other countries which do very successfully in terms of housing delivery and also affordable housing.
Thanks, Anne. And Sharon, I understand Birmingham City Council, they are a council that builds social housing, and you've touched on upstreaming. And Shama's also talked about the sort of funding challenges. What do you think the councils can be doing or could be changed that will help upstream upstream more children and kids coming through the housing system?
I think first of all, I think nationally they need to address the policies because they don't make it easy for councils to build in the first place. I guess because of the current model, it means that we have to do more mixed tenure. So I know for us as a council, we're very clear that actually our housing schemes, they are mixed tenure. So we do have some houses that we sell for homeowners, we do have some for social rent, we do have council properties. So that's really important, but it's connecting with the community. Because we build ourselves, we understand our communities and our city. So we are able to build properties that fit in with the needs and the desires of communities, whilst also having a grown-up conversation with them about what we can do and what we can't do as a local authority. So I think that we really need to be really clear on some of that and bringing people along. So I think that's absolutely essential. And I think the other part of it is moving forward with house building. I think that like all parts of housing in the pandemic, we need to not just be talking about recovery, but actually redesign of how we're going to do things, because some things we didn't do that great in the first place as a country, if we're honest. So actually it's about redesigning and rethinking about how are we going to do local neighbourhoods and look at it from a neighbourhoods perspective rather than just a house and a unit perspective. What do the streets look like? Is there going to be low traffic on there? Where are the local amenities in terms of schools and things like that? And on some of our high streets and in our city centres, with more people not working from home, do we need to build more properties that have workspace rather than more concentration on that extra bedroom? Or, properties above working blocks and things like that. So we need to repurpose and reimagine where we're going and that it fits in with all different people that live in different parts of the sector, because that is what voters really want and that's what we need in local communities.
And Sharon, you talked about, previously about collaboration in a meaningful way across different departments. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that means?
Yeah, so when it comes to collaboration, we're big on that in the city. The Homelessness Prevention Act talked about a duty to refer. In Birmingham, we try to talk about a commitment to collaborate. So we'll work across sectors. So it's how does each sector contribute towards the issue and the bigger purpose. So one, in terms of the council, where we do our own house building, we look at how do we support the economy. So we have a list of procurement of local SMEs that we draw on to help to support, so that we're helping them in their businesses as well. With the business sector, we're talking to them about what does homelessness prevention look like within their businesses and how do they deal with that in terms of their staff. And again, commitment to collaborate even on the most micro level is we have a group of what we call experts by experience. And those that know me, I was a homeless teenager, so I value actually getting the experiences of people. We have a group of people that have lived through the housing and homelessness pathway, and they challenge us all the way through it when we're trying to look at system change, because we want to prevent people from falling through the gaps that make them the most vulnerable and actually push them into crisis in the first place.
And Shama, you talked about connecting communities. What's Brent doing well, and how does progressive Labour government encourage that?
I think it's understanding your communities. I think Sharon is completely right about understanding what is it that our communities want. They want to see local jobs. In addition, they want to be connected to the opportunity that arises from regeneration. And so in Brent, we've had a huge regeneration of Wembley, £3 billion worth nearly. We're doing our own regeneration in South Borough, in South Kilburn, and we're generating a huge amount of revenue in terms of the infrastructure levy. And how do we redirect that infrastructure levy, for example, to residents who need it? And also understanding that addressing some of those inequalities actually may not be best placed to be delivered by the council, but facilitating and empowering grassroots organisations through regeneration to deliver that, say, employment programmes, for example. So we use our neighbourhood community infrastructure levy to empower some employment organisations who do some fantastic mentoring work of young people, of older people, to get them back into employment. So it's really understanding how it works. And in Brent, we've given nearly £15 million in neighbourhood CIL to community organisations to actually connect opportunity to residents who are seeing this huge amount of regeneration in Brent, actually then connecting it to that and seeing facilities and things that they need to see from in their communities expanded and so on. So it's working. That works really well. It's also we've embarked on a couple of schemes, but council-led schemes, where we've actually had community stakeholder groups who are part of the decision-making process about what goes into a particular scheme. So we have one in Stonebridge, for example, where we're building 65 council homes, as well as a brand new adult education centre. And that was all worked in collaboration with community stakeholders from Stonebridge. If you don't know Stonebridge, it has some of the lowest wages in London. We have some of our residents earning £18,000 a year, and it's a huge economic inactivity in Stonebridge, as well as huge issues around being right next to the North Circular, and sort of air quality issues and sort of children's educational outcomes and attainment are a real issue. So that collaboration with the community, in my mind, was really progressive. It wasn't that we were saying nothing's going to be built on that site. It was going to be built. Actually, what was going to be built was in collaboration with the community about what they needed to see to regeneration mean to them. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing in Brent.
Interesting. And there was obviously that fine balance between collaboration with the community and leaning too far the other way. I mean, we've seen Housing Secretary Marcia Fudge in the United States say, she wants to end this notion of something called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Anthony, how is the discretionary case-by-case system and getting that balance right? We've seen it as what Shama's been able to achieve in Brent, where it's worked. But when it goes too far the other way, how does that create inequalities?
Yeah, sure. So what we can see from kind of the best evidence on kind of who kind of engages in consultations that are done commonly. So the best research, and this is from Massachusetts in the United States, a book called Neighborhood Defenders, is they show that the people who typically respond to consultations about should a house be built here, should we allow this suburban house to be turned into a small block of flats, or allow this warehouse to be redeveloped and turned into shops, etc. The comments are overwhelmingly negative and kind of hostile towards redevelopment, but they're also from systemically advantaged groups. So they tend to be older, whiter, maler, and more and wealthier as well. And if we have a system and framework where we allow kind of communities to exercise a veto over new homes being built or new social homes being built, or new kind of accommodation for people in homeless shelters, what we're doing is we're allowing the most affluent and most privileged members of society to control who can live in places and who's allowed to become a member of the community. So I think when we're thinking about community engagement, I think the stuff Shama's been doing sounds excellent, and bringing together really kind of disadvantaged members of the community and making sure that their voices are heard in the process. That should really, I think, be the kind of guiding principle, I think, of community consultation in this way. And from a systemic and institutional point of view, this often means kind of moving away from like case-by-case comment towards one where, when we're creating the local plan, when we're sort of making a decision about all the decisions that affect everyone in the community, making sure that we reach out to those groups and bringing them into the conversation when we're deciding, okay, how should this piece of land be used? Okay, how should we redevelop this particular site? How should we regenerate this particular area, rather than allowing kind of lots of individual vetoes from all over the place.
No, thanks, Anne. I'm going to bring some of the questions forward because we've had quite a lot of good ones in the chat. The first one, I know you touched on earlier on about how did the French build 400,000 homes. I mean, maybe we'll ask Anne to pick that up a bit later on. There was one from Andrew Dixon, which discusses the regressive nature of council tax, particularly on the regions. I didn't know, will property tax reform be part of an offering to resolve the housing crisis? Sharon, or Sharon, what's your thoughts on council tax? Is it regressive up in Birmingham, would you say?
Sorry, I thought you said Shama.
No, sorry, Sharon. I was going to go to Shama, but then I realised she's quite the call.
Yeah, I think when it comes to council tax, that's always a difficult one, for any local authority, and it does make a huge difference. And when it comes to houses and properties and people sustaining, I think the biggest thing for councils actually is when you start looking at the bigger picture beyond housing, is if local government was actually funded properly, we wouldn't have to really be looking at addressing council tax in the first place. So there's a bigger question there around actually how is local government supported and funded in the first place, so that we could focus our energy and our time into making sure that we can develop more properties. So I think fundamentally, nationally, we do need to look at council tax, but you can't look at council tax without the conversation of the funding of local government. I think that's ultimately where my starting point is. And whilst council tax is a big driver and something that we need to look at, we do also need to look at land banking, the land delivery, the cost of land. That's what makes it difficult to build and keep the housing market down. So it's not just council tax we should be focusing on, but we should have a concerted effort to focus on actually the housing market and the cost of the housing market as well. Absolutely
spot on in my opinion there, Sharon. We've had a question from Jack Shaw. Shama, if I give this one to you, who discusses NIMBYism, arguably sometimes worse on the left than it is on the right. If we're coming from a sort of Leicester centre perspective here on the politics of housing, and he broadly believes that it's fair to say Labour speaks to renters and the Conservatives speak to homeowners. I mean, how does the left of centre speak to homeowners too, in your opinion?
This is where I think we sometimes are too inward looking in ourselves as a party, in terms of understanding that people living in homes are not just renters. They are a big part of the market, yes, but actually largely homeowners are our grandparents who've got a house too big and got a lot of capital assets in their household that they need to kind of, how do we support them? How do we support somebody who's inherited a property and is a landlord by accident and not by, some sort of career that they want to do? But similarly, it's also working with landlords who are responsible landlords. There is a huge number of landlords who are responsible, who want to do well, and actually property investment for them is something that gives them bits of financial security. And we should not be shy and afraid to talk to those residents and talk to those voters about what is it that we should be doing for homeowners. Homeowners at the moment in London, particularly, land value is a huge issue. As a parent myself, and if you look at people who want to see their children and their families move on, buying property in London is ridiculously difficult unless you have the bank of mum and dad. And actually, that's an aspirational conversation. How is it that you want your children to do better than you? And homeowners are part of that conversation. So we should not be afraid in any way, shape or form to say we can speak to renters and we can speak to homeowners too. It should not be one or the other. It should be both, because aspiration actually for both is actually something that we should be looking to work towards. It shouldn't be something that we're afraid of doing.
Thanks, Shama. And Anthony, to the point earlier about how do the French build 400,000 homes, and you touched on Japan earlier. I know Paul Cheshire up at LSC stated you can get planning permission within 14 days. Some places in the UK can take over 2 years just to get an outline. What's the differences there in a bit more detail?
So the French kind of planning system, kind of, as I understand it, is more kind of form-based, is kind of the jargon used to describe it, right? Where they look at sort of what's the what kind of the characteristics of the existing neighborhood, right? Is it kind of an urban neighborhood? Is it like a suburban neighborhood, like suburban rural, or is it like a distinctly kind of rural neighborhood? And then each of those kind of different types of neighborhood then gets has certain guidelines associated with it, where if you propose something that sort of fits within those guidelines for that particular type of neighborhood, then you're allowed to build something, whatever complies with those particular guidelines. So in some ways, it's a bit of a hybrid between what the Conservatives are proposing, where you don't have that same kind of distinction of uses. So it's not so much about segregating residential from commercial, from skyscrapers, etc. But it's then also it's a bit more restrictive than what they're proposing, in that you do have these kind of distinct types of neighborhood which then fit into different categories and have different rules associated with them. And I think really kind of the key thing is both with the French example and the Japanese example, which is like that, it's quite close to what we've suggested, our kind of flexible zoning 12 zones proposal, is the certainty, right? Where if you propose something that complies to the rules, you can build. And what that does is it reconnects the supply of houses to demand. That where there is demand for people to move to a particular area, or if kind of house prices are rising in a particular area, then it becomes possible for the housing supply to respond and provide more houses in a particular location. And the current UK system doesn't do that. Right? We have a very system which disconnects supply from demand, because we have this case-by-case decision making, and it creates, it means we have a situation where places like Sunderland and Wakefield, kind of very kind of affordable and kind of low demand markets, are providing far more houses than places like Oxford and Brighton, which are very expensive and have terrible housing shortages. So kind of reconnecting supply to demand through kind of greater certainty in the planning system and following the rules is the kind of change we need to get somewhere closer to France.
Thanks, Anthony. I mean, just on the sort of topic of home ownership, we've seen a recent, article in the Financial Times talk about Barratt Britain, and we use the term red wall, but these places were voting Tory, and because a lot of them have had supply come into their market, and they are able to buy. And I know you've touched on Shama and Sharon, the sort of land value impacts that we have. Just as someone that works, hands up, for a property developer in the land acquisition team whose company has had 4 planning rejections despite resubmissions, it's fair to say that there is issues in the planning system, and we need to have real conversations from a centre-left modernising perspective about how do we tackle land values. And at the moment, it is in effect, illegal to build houses without permission. And we wonder how we are building half of our, the rate of our, contemporaries in France. But, how do we get back onto, councils being able to deliver social housing, and also encourage, being that party of home ownership and aspiration again? Sharon, is there anything that we can do, or councils can do, if they're able to deliver homes of mixed tenures? Should we only be building social homes? Should it be mixed tenures? We've had comments about demonising those that attempt to do that. Is that the way we should be going?
I think mixed tenure is important. I think in Birmingham, that's what we do. We build mixed tenure, partly because of the financial model. But it's more than just about what you're building. It's about any homeowner, once they've bought their property, they want to know that the property price isn't going to drop because of the local area or what's going on in the local area. They want to know that when they're living in their home, they're going to feel safe and secure and actually can spend the rest of their days there if they so choose to. It's those things that they're interested in. It's exactly the same that renters would think about as well, to be quite honest, and those getting on the market. With us in Birmingham, we do do mixed tenure as a council when we build. That's important. The days of old when we just used to have council estates, you shouldn't just have like one group of people sitting in one area and then, a gated community over there. We need to bring that in. But also, if you look at inequalities and the way people live together, grow up together, grow old together, it's really important to address that. In Birmingham, the other thing that we looked at was what were the things that created stereotypes about different types of people and different types of housing. So for instance, if you had a council house, there was a particular type of door, everybody knew it was a council house. So what we do is when we build, we make sure we look at the architecture, we look at what fits in with that actual neighbourhood, not what is the typical cheapest door that we can put on a property. So in some parts of the city, all the houses that we build, they look quite Victorian. The other side of the city, it might be something else, a different style, because it fits in with the local neighbourhood and it's neighbourhood living. Majority of people who live in neighbourhoods do not walk around saying, oh, house owner, or I'm not going to speak to my neighbour because he's a councillor, he lives in a council house. Housing association, we don't live like that, we don't behave like that. It's just in politics, we get into this echo chamber and think that's how normal people think and speak and feel.
Absolutely. We've got 2 more questions I want to make sure we get answered before 2:47 to be precise. The first one I would like to give to Ant. So we've had a question from John Paul Chevington. You know, do we expect post-COVID more central office space to be converted into housing? And is it possible for it to be social housing, you know, as working from home becomes more common? You know, is this an opportunity to accelerate affordable housing stock, or will it lead to poor quality dwellings? I mean, there's a number of questions in that, but hopefully you can distill it down, you know, with regards to permitted development routes.
Yeah, sure. So I think our overarching kind of assessment at central cities is that cities are going to continue to be important economically, and in particular, kind of, although there's a lot of discussion and conversation around, you know, the death of the city centre office, we think that the characteristics that city centres have, that, you know, you can meet people from other companies and share ideas very easily, much more easily than over Zoom. You've got like a very, very large labour market where if you're a worker, you can find new jobs more easily than if you're looking in a more kind of isolated location, and firms can find lots of workers as well. But those characteristics are going to remain in place kind of after the pandemic. And although we may kind of see some sorting, we may see sort of some changes around kind of remote working and working from home. I think actually some of the biggest kind of demand drops for office working will actually be on kind of business parks. Like if you're thinking about, you know, driving kind of 20, 30 minutes to have an experience which is in many respects kind of similar to working from home, as opposed to kind of the relative advantages of commuting into city centre offices, I think is where I would sort of place my money in terms of where we will see the biggest kind of shifts in demand. But I think more broadly thinking about like kind of PDR and office conversions, we've sort of seen over like last year, kind of big changes were introduced to the commercial property use class regime, which means that, you know, shops, offices, workshops, you know, restaurants are now all a single use class, and there are now flexibilities being introduced to make it easier to turn those buildings into homes. And we would expect quite a few of those, especially in kind of the southeast of England, to get converted into new flats over the next 3 or 4 years, because in many places we have too much retail space actually, and converting that and making sure that those conversions are high quality and you know, can help meet kind of housing need in the southeast, I think is going to be a big challenge for councils over the next 5 years as we recover from the pandemic.
Cheers, Anne. Another question. We've got a couple more, and just try and see if we can squeeze them in for Shama, and I've probably got a comment on this myself. What did the panel think about some of the new financing models that utilise, you know, pension fund investment, and can these help to increase the ability of local authorities and housing associations to build more council houses? I mean, just from my experience and sort of research over in the States, there is a funding mechanism called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. Shama and I have discussed it on the affordable housing workshops at the Labour Housing Group. So there are progressives that are interested to get involved, where, you know, we use tax relief to be sold in exchange for money with corporates, and then what that does is you then put that into new homes for social rent, and you incentivize the private sector as well as the not-for-profits to do that. But more to that point of the question, Shama, what about these new funding models? Can we utilize them, and are we utilizing them at the moment?
I think we can, and I think we should, and I think councils should be brave to look at exploring that model. And I think it's about understanding what is it that we want to achieve, and what's our priority here. The Public Works Loan Board, recently the percentage increase on the borrowing has meant that if every percentage increase, I think it's about £1 million, that will increase debt for council. So if you can get financing that actually doesn't impact on the debt repayment of councils, that's going to be prohibitive, why not explore that partnership? Because at the end of the day, my priority as a cabinet member and as a councillor is actually see my residents living on the council housing waiting list and in temporary accommodation, getting good, secure homes. That is the priority above all and end all. And if we can get partners, wherever the money's coming from in terms of private investment, who are looking for a bit more security, there is nothing more secure than council housing. in my mind. You are always going to need it. So that would be my answer.
Sorry to cut across. Joe Crossy's also asked one for you.
Yeah.
What makes a good developer or partner in terms of engagement with the communities? Are there things that aren't already done which should be universal to help bring local people along?
I think it depends on developers. Some developers are better than others. Some councils are better than others in how they engage the communities. We've had experiences where we're embarking on long-term relationships with developers who spent a year putting together community groups, stakeholder groups, steering groups with the local community and schools and churches and so on to be part of that offer. And as a result, this developer, we managed to get the master plan done in 11 months through planning. And the delivery in their first phase is not only all the social housing which Brent is buying through the Section 106 obligations, and first people are moving in October or November time, but we're also building the community centre and all the community facilities, which is what the community wanted to be delivered first, alongside the 3,000 homes that are going to be delivered in that part of Brent. So it can work, and I think developers need to be understanding and be open to discussions, robust and honest conversations with the council about what our priorities are and what their priorities are, and finding a way of working together. And it can happen. Some developers are better than others.
Thanks, Sam. We've had also a question from Charlotte Martin about how can Labour approach engaging first-time buyers and those not having the bank of mum and dad, and saving 10% deposit feels out of reach for many. Meanwhile, Anna Lynch says we need to stop being snobbish about shared ownership. I mean, just to reflect on my personal circumstances as a shared owner whose service charge under a nondescript housing association has doubled within 4 years, as well as my EW1S form jargon for like how flammable is the building you're living in has now been downgraded. There's a lot left to be said about shared ownership, but the model in itself I don't think should be denigrated. There are models in America, flexible equity, where as a shared owner at the moment, I'm 100% liable for all of the liabilities, even though I only own 25%. Flexible equity, or FLEQ, FLEQ.com, is a new innovative thing coming out of Pittsburgh, which I think governments could replicate. Just as a quick one, I don't know, Anthony Breach, as a potential shared owner, what are your thoughts on how do we help those not having the bank of mum and dad?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be some role for the government and non-profits in supporting people who want to get into home ownership to make that jump. We know for, in a variety of reasons that it's an effective way of saving and kind of building up a nest egg, which you can use later in life to give you security in a way that renting is much more difficult. I think broadly, one of the problems that British policies had since the 60s and 70s is it's come up with more and more intricate and expensive ways of offering subsidy to homeowners and not really addressed that supply problem. So we've kind of pumped up demand in lots of different ways, but then have really struggled to sort of increase that supply element. So let's kind of have like shared ownership schemes. Let's fix those problems. But we also need to be thinking about increasing the construction rate of housing, and that can only come through tackling these problems of our planning system that we've been discussing.
Thanks, Anthony. Well, on that point, I'd like to sort of bring the discussion to a close. I'd like to thank our panelists for what has been an invigorating discussion with thought leaders in this space. I'm sure in normal times we'd be giving our panel a huge round of applause for their contributions today. Just for the closing remarks, I think we should consider Cllr's words this morning on how we need to look not to previous manifestos, but to the problems that we'll face in the 2020s and 30s. There's without a doubt, the challenges of housing, a changing society, and rising wealth inequality will be the problems that we need to overcome as we do indeed look forward. We heard earlier today from Glenn O'Hara about how after the Second World War, Attlee won, having come back from a shattered Labour Party. He did this by putting an ambitious housing agenda at the centre of his campaign. Biden and his first black housing secretary in over 40 years, Secretary Marcia Fudge, have too put an ambitious housing agenda at the heart of their progressive campaign, where expansion of rental assistance, creating opportunities for home ownership, and getting rid of the notion of not in my backyard and housing as a human right featured heavily. Today, we've seen that through Labour, we can achieve transformative and modernising change if we become a party of aspiration, becoming the party of renters and homeowners, and take the tough but necessary action to create rules where society's challenges can be overcome. It's now 10 to 3. We'll be taking a short break before we hear from Peter Mandelson on how now is the time for a progressive Britain. So thanks for listening, and hope you all enjoy the break. Cheers.
Well, thanks everyone.